Chapter 1. The world was a mausoleum of cold marble and older secrets, and Alara had finally reached its dust-caked altar. The manor of Ethelred, Baron of the Ashlands, was not built for comfort. It was forged as a monument to ancient, unforgiving survival, its high, Gothic windows like the sightless eyes of a colossal, watchful predator. Outside, the skeletal branches of black oaks clawed at a moonless sky, and the silence was so profound it felt like a form of immense, suffocating pressure. Alara stumbled on the frozen gravel of the forecourt, the sudden, sharp pain in her ankle barely registering against the roaring exhaustion in her veins and the absolute, crushing weight of the last 3 days. She was running on borrowed time, borrowed conviction, and a few meager hours of poisoned sleep. Her fine wool cloak, once a comforting barrier against the November chill, now felt like a lead shroud. Inside her palm, the small, tarnished silver locket, her only anchor, burned with a feverish, inexplicable cold. She was not merely tired, she was a collapsing structure of trauma and terror, and the thing she carried, the prophecy she unknowingly embodied, was tearing her apart from the inside. She dragged herself up the final, crumbling stone steps, her breath rasping in her throat, tasting of copper and despair. The front door, wrought iron and obsidian, stood slightly ajar, a silent, gaping invitation. The Baron, or whatever ancient thing wore his skin now, did not bother with security. Why should he? This domain was sealed by a covenant older than the kings of man, protected by a reputation that turned blood to ice in the veins of even the most hardened mercenaries. Everyone knew the tale: come here only for judgment, and never expect mercy. The air within the foyer was colder than the night outside, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron and ozone, like the aftermath of a distant, bloodless storm. Her steps echoed on the black and white tiled floor, each sound a thunderous betrayal in the cavernous silence. She moved not by sight, but by an insane, fearful focus. The great, sweeping staircase was a ladder to nowhere, its shadows coalescing into shapes that made her breath hitch. Her goal was the study, the supposed seat of the Baron's power. She forced herself around a corner, past a suit of armor that looked far too tall and too still, and then her vision blurred, the darkness closing in at the edges like a tide of black ink. She saw him. He was seated not behind the immense mahogany desk, but in a wingback chair by a fireplace that was, ironically, not lit. He was a silhouette against the far wall's massive curtained window, impossibly still, a study in lethal repose. His posture spoke of centuries of unchallenged authority and profound, aching weariness. He was built like a fallen god, all lean, sculpted power wrapped in formal black velvet. His skin, even in the near darkness, an inhuman shade of cold, polished marble. Alara's momentum failed her completely. Her legs buckled, her head spun. The world tilted, the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling rushing toward her. She hit the floor not with a crash, but with a sickening, heavy thud that stole the air from her lungs. She lay there, tangled in her cloak, too weak to move, too terrified to speak. All her planning, all her desperate flight, culminated in this humiliating, utterly vulnerable moment on the dusty, unforgiving floor. She could feel his gaze on her, an unseen, palpable force, dissecting her fear, her weakness, her essence, yet he did not move, did not make a sound. It was the most terrible stillness she had ever known. A choked, desperate whisper escaped her. I'm scared. The words tasted like ash. He's going to kill me. She didn't mean any mortal enemy. She meant the thing inside her, the power she couldn't control. The confession was for him, the creature of infinite night, the only one who might understand a monstrous secret. Then, as if the ancient house itself was confirming her fate, a sudden, blinding flash of pure, white-hot light split the oppressive darkness outside, illuminating the room for a heart-stopping second. It was followed by a colossal, chest-vibrating thunder that shook the very foundations of Ethelred Manor. The ancient vampire finally, imperceptibly, shifted in his chair. He was the only anchor in a world that had just been violently fractured. The stillness was over. Chapter 2. The aftershock of the thunder faded, leaving an oppressive silence that felt louder than the blast itself. The flash had provided a stark, horrifying portrait of the room. The Baron's face, sculpted in an expression of eternal, profound melancholy. The faint, terrible sheen of red in his eyes, now narrowed on her. The sheer, insurmountable distance between her collapsed form and his unassailable throne. He was Ethelred, the Anacorite, the last of his line to hold the title of king in all but name, burdened with the maintenance of the iron covenants and the centuries of blood and sorrow it demanded. He finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, an ancient language refined by eons of disuse, like the turning of tectonic plates beneath the earth. It was formal, precise, and devoid of warmth, yet carried an undertone of immense, terrible power held tightly in check. You trespass in a sealed place, child of man. You speak of an unknown killer. Be clear and sparse with your intent. My patience is measured in centuries, but my tolerance for weakness is less than a breath. Alara forced herself to push up onto her elbows, the effort making her temples throb with a vicious, sudden pain. She struggled to keep his marble-cold gaze fixed, knowing that looking away would be the final surrender. Not a killer, she managed, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. A destiny, a prophecy. I am the vessel of the void. It is not a title I sought. It is a contagion I cannot contain. She held up her left hand, revealing the thin, pale silver scar that spiraled up her forearm like a root of frost. It was not a wound, it was a brand of power, and it pulsed faintly beneath her skin, a low, painful thrumming. They tried to purge it, the Cinder Coven. They failed. They believe I have become a weapon they cannot wield, and so they have condemned me. They sent a Purhos, a hunter, to sterilize the infection, but I outran him. Ethelred leaned forward slightly, a movement of liquid grace that was far more unnerving than a sudden lunge. The faint light catching the edges of his features only emphasized the utter perfection and coldness of his beauty. The Cinder Coven, he repeated, the name spoken with an utterly chilling contempt, a cabal of panicked mortals attempting to contain what they cannot comprehend. Predictable. They sought to harness a primordial force and now fear its inevitable consequence. He rose then, a slow, deliberate unfolding of power that seemed to drain the residual light from the room. He was taller than she had imagined, a looming, terrifying presence. He walked toward her, not with predatory speed, but with an unnerving, measured pace, the faint whisper of his fine boots on the marble the only sound. He stopped a foot from her collapsed form, and the sheer proximity of his ancient power was almost suffocating. The air grew perceptibly colder, and the metallic scent intensified. She could see the horrifying clarity of his eyes now, not red, but a deep, mesmerizing amber, flecked with gold, ancient and utterly non-human. His shadow consumed her. The vessel of the void, he mused, the words now intimate, a cruel, soft assessment. He knelt, one knee dropping to the floor without a sound, bringing his face level with hers. The formality of his language never wavered, even in this position of profound physical scrutiny. The prophecies of the lesser houses are often ornate lies crafted for power, but the void, that is a rare and terrible truth. It suggests an imbalance, a breaking of the first seal. You carry immense potential for destruction, child. Why come to the one entity in this broken world who has sworn through a sacred and binding oath to maintain that balance? I should purge you myself, shatter the vessel, and eliminate the threat before it forces my hand in the wider conflict. His hand, impossibly pale and ringless, reached out, hovering above her face. She felt a phantom chill on her skin, a premonition of contact that would be simultaneously agonizing and final. This was the moment of judgment. Her breath hitched. She couldn't argue, couldn't lie. She had come here for a reason more desperate than survival. "Because you are the anchor," she whispered, the thematic word leaving her lips like a prayer. "The coven fears the void, but you fear the chaos its containment would unleash. They would sacrifice a world to save their coven. You, by your very nature, must save the world to save your own eternity. I need to understand it, control it, before it consumes me and shatters the seal. I know the oath. You are bound to protect the balance. Killing me is a permanent solution, but it is not a measured one. The Purhos, he is still coming. If he finds me, the resulting confrontation will force your hand and break your precious quietude forever." He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, his expression utterly unreadable. His fingers, long and elegant, finally brushed her chin, tilting her face up slightly. It was a touch of marble, on silk, without warmth, yet the gesture was one of deep, intense focus. He was not looking at her face. He was looking into her soul, gauging the truth in her terror. "A beautiful gamble," Ethelred finally murmured, a breath of cold air against her skin. "To use my most ancient and binding burden against me. Stand, vessel. If you are to be my problem, I prefer not to discuss covenants on the floor." Chapter 3. The command was absolute, an imperative forged in the crucible of time and authority. Elara, despite the tremors that ran through her body, found herself rising on sheer willpower alone, pulled upright more by the terrifying focus of his gaze than by her own strength. The shift in perspective was jarring. She was now on eye level with the Vampire King, and the overwhelming sense of his contained, ancient power was magnified. Ethelred made no move to help her, a silent, implicit test of her fortitude. When she finally stood, swaying slightly, he stepped back, a perfect picture of aristocratic detachment. He gestured toward the immense, dark mahogany desk with an almost imperceptible flick of his hand. "Sit. You have established a compelling, if dramatically phrased, argument for temporary sanctuary. You have positioned your existence as a necessary, if volatile variable in the Iron Covenant. Convince me this is not merely the desperate cunning of a cornered beast. Detail the nature of this void. Use terminology that transcends mortal panic, ideal in absolutes, in the architecture of this reality, not in human fright." Elara moved stiffly to the chair, the velvet upholstery a momentary, almost unbearable luxury. The act of sitting provided a small, stabilizing anchor. She took a ragged, deliberate breath, forcing herself to channel the remnants of her academic training, the dark academia she had once adored, before it became her tomb. "The void is not merely darkness," she began, her voice gaining a fragile intellectual steel. "It is the anti-neuma, the unbreath, the negation of creation's initial spark. It is the unmaking. The Cinder Coven sought to bind this primordial energy into a mortal shell to create an ultimate weapon against the Elder Fae. They used a ritual of corrupted syndesmos, a perverse binding, to graft a shard of the void to my nascent magical potential." She held up the locket then, letting the faint candlelight, which now flickered to life in the sconces around the room with no visible trigger, catch its tarnished surface. "This is the focus they used. It was intended to be the control. Instead, it became the conduit. My human core, my conviction, my loneliness, my trauma, all act as a highly volatile catalyst. When I feel a profound, acute emotion, terror, grief, or a surge of protective instinct, the void attempts to manifest, not as power, but as a black, entropic suction. It does not destroy by fire or force, but by a chilling, absolute cessation. It drains life force, magic, and, if unleashed fully, the very sense of a place, leaving behind only nullity and ash. The last time it flared, I killed 3 coven guards and drained an entire grove of ancient vital woods to dust. I did not mean to. It was a purely defensive, unconscious reaction to fear. Ethelred listened, his marble-still face revealing nothing, his amber eyes piercing. He moved to his desk, poured a single measure of a dark, viscous liquid into a crystal tumbler, not blood, but something darker, older, perhaps a distilled pain, and regarded her over the rim before taking a slow, deliberate sip. He was utterly relaxed, yet radiating a terrible, latent vigilance. The syndesmos is a forgotten art. To attempt it on a primordial source, the arrogance of mortals remains a constant, tedious variable, he observed, dismissing the coven with a wave of his hand. The threat is clear. If you cannot control this cessation, you will become a walking catastrophe, a blight that destabilizes the entire region, shattering the delicate, centuries-old peace I maintain against the Fey Lords and the restless, forgotten things in the deep earth. That is a violation of the Iron Covenant. Your control must be absolute, or your containment must be permanent. He set the glass down with a precise, echoing click. His gaze hardened, losing the last vestige of its ancient melancholy and becoming purely executive, political. Here is the bargain, Vessel. You require tutelage in the application of absolute control. I require the removal of an existential threat to my domain. I cannot, by oath, allow you to be taken by the Coven, as that would signify an external force dictating the terms of my internal stability. I cannot, by oath, allow you to trigger the cessation on my lands. You will remain within this manor, a prisoner under the direct supervision of the Anacorite. You will learn to control this power, not by binding it, but by mastering the emotional catalyst that fuels it. And your lessons will begin now. He moved around the desk, his velvet coat whispering like a dry leaf. He stopped directly in front of her chair, his immense height dominating her. She looked up and for the first time saw a flicker of something she had not expected, a terrifying, fierce, protective drive, rooted entirely in self-interest, but powerful. Nonetheless, the Porhos you mentioned. He is coming, yes, and I will allow him to cross my borders, but he will be met by a force he cannot conceive. You have sought sanctuary, and you shall have it, but be warned, my sanctuary is merely a more comfortable form of high-stakes burden. Do not fail me, Alara, for if you do, the judgment will be final, and it will be delivered by my own hand. Chapter 4. The air in the study, already heavy with the weight of ancient compacts and unspoken threats, now crackled with a purely physical tension. Ethelred's proclamation was a cold, brutal covenant, and Alara, despite the instinctual terror, found a strange, desperate hope in its severity. He did not offer warmth or kindness. He offered a terrifying path to survival, one that placed the burden of world stability squarely on her collapsing shoulders. This was a trade, not a rescue, and that suited her better than false mercy. What is the nature of the lesson? Alara asked, her voice steady now, buoyed by the necessity of the task. She refused to look away, meeting his unyielding amber gaze. How does one master a primal force that is intrinsically linked to one's deepest fear and loneliness? Ethelred gave a slow, minimal incline of his head, a gesture that conveyed a centuries-old appreciation for directness. He did not bother with pleasantries or gentle introductions to her new reality. The void is a reaction to an emotional deficit, not a tool, he stated, his voice a low, instructional baritone. The Coven sought to bind power. You must bind self. Control is not suppression. It is the absolute surgical calibration of intent. You fear the monster within, and that fear fuels the monster. I know this cycle. I have lived this cycle for 2,000 years. He raised his own hand, the one that had brushed her chin, and slowly, deliberately, drew back the cuff of his velvet coat, revealing the pale, perfect skin of his forearm. There, etched deeply into the marble-like skin, was a series of intricate flowing symbols that looked neither like language nor art, but like the visual representation of an agonizing oath. They pulsed faintly, a nearly invisible network of dark, fine lines. "This," he said, his voice dropping in pitch, becoming deeply intimate and profoundly melancholy, "is the apostasia, the oath of the fallen. It is the binding covenant that restricts my nature. Every day, every century, I feel the primal drive of my condition, the hunger, the murderous arrogance, the lust for absolute dominion. The apostasia does not remove the desire, it enforces the choice. It is a permanent physical reminder that every action must be measured against the cost of an eternity. That cost is what gives me control. It is my anchor. You need your own." He extended his forearm toward her, presenting the arcane etching as a gruesome living textbook. "Your lessons will involve the controlled, incremental provocation of the emotional states that trigger the void. You will learn to ride the wave of terror and grief, to acknowledge the temptation of the cessation, and yet choose to hold the line. Your anchor must be an emotion more powerful than fear, something that demands preservation, not destruction." Alara looked at the marks on his arm, a testament to an unbearable, self-imposed guilt. She understood the implication. He was a creature defined by self-hatred, turning his immense power inward to maintain the world's stability. He was offering her the same terrifying path. "And what do you suggest I use as my anchor?" she asked, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He withdrew his arm, the cuff falling back into place, concealing the ancient, painful truth. His amber eyes, however, seemed to absorb all the candlelight, burning with an almost frightening intensity. "You came here driven by guilt and a profound sense of self-loathing because of the power you carry," he observed, his analysis clinically cruel. "Guilt is a powerful motivator, but a terrible anchor. It breeds self-destruction. No, your core is not defined by destruction, but by a fiercely protective instinct. You ran from the coven not only to save yourself, but to prevent the void from being used to unleash chaos on the world. This small act of immense conviction is the seed." He took one slow step closer, invading her space just enough to be intimidating. "Your anchor will be the one thing you must protect at all costs. The truth of who you are, the burden of the choice you carry, and the knowledge that the void, while deadly, is now irrevocably a part of your essence. You must choose to preserve it, not by loving it, but by mastering it, for the sake of the fragile peace. The world must not shatter on your account. That, Alara, is the only choice you have left to make." He turned abruptly, ending the conversation with the decisiveness of a coffin lid slamming shut. "A chamber will be prepared for you. It is defensible. You will eat. You will rest. At the midnight hour, we begin. Do not attempt to flee. This place is sealed against every form of magic and movement. Do not attempt to use the void. I can contain a nascent power for a short time, and the price of that containment will be your immediate, permanent end. You are mine now, under the terms of the Iron Covenant. Understand the weight of that. It is the only thing keeping you alive." Chapter 5. The chamber assigned to Alara was a study in cold, oppressive luxury, situated high in the eastern wing, overlooking the vast, silent, and intimidatingly dark grounds. The four-poster bed was immense, draped in heavy, dust-scented tapestries. The furniture was carved from dark, somber wood, and the only visible illumination came from the single, tall window, where the weak moonlight, now sporadically breaking through the storm clouds, laid stark, cold bars across the marble floor. It was a beautiful cage, a silent, pale-faced retainer whose movements were unnervingly fluid and whose eyes held an ancient, exhausted resignation, had provided a change of clothes, simple, dark woolen garments far warmer than her ruined cloak, and a tray bearing a small decanter of clear, unidentifiable liquid and a plate of dry, hard biscuits. The sustenance was purely practical, offering no comfort. Alara did not eat. She stood at the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, staring out at the wilderness that surrounded the manor, a landscape of shattered gray and black that perfectly mirrored her internal state. She was trapped, under the yoke of an ancient creature, yet paradoxically, she felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. The burden of running was gone, replaced by the crushing burden of Ethelred's expectations. He needs me to live. He needs me to control it. The necessity is my only shield. She looked down at her left forearm, tracing the frosty spiral of the void scar with a trembling finger. The locket, still clutched in her right hand, felt heavier than lead. The vessel of the void. The words were no longer a frightened whisper, but a high-stakes, terrifying identity. She remembered the sheer, black vacuum that had erupted from her when the Coven guards had cornered her, the way their life force had been instantaneously and silently sucked out, leaving them desiccated shells. It was not violence, it was extinction. She realized Ethelred's diagnosis was correct. She had to learn to value the choice, the power to choose not to destroy, above all else. But how could she master a force that was inextricably linked to the raw, uncontrolled panic of mortal fear? A soft, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence. Alara spun around, her heart vaulting into her throat. Ethelred was standing in the deep shadow near the chamber door. He had not walked in, he had simply been there. He was no longer in his formal attire, but wore a heavy, dark woolen tunic, its severity only emphasizing the lean, preternatural power of his form. His expression, usually a mask of detached melancholy, held an unnerving intensity, a predatory focus. "Your vigilance is admirable, yet futile," he said, stepping into the meager light. "This is a castle of silence. You will not hear me move, ever. You seek the answer to how one masters fear. The answer is simple. You must first confront the catalyst, not the physical threat, but the internal one." He walked slowly toward her, his movements a symphony of liquid, unnatural grace. There was a terrible beauty in his motion, the perfection of a lethal, living mechanism. She stood her ground, forcing herself not to recoil, using his own lesson, the necessity of survival, to anchor herself. "My presence is the only catalyst we require for this first lesson," he continued, stopping a few feet away, his shadow once again engulfing her. "I am the ultimate external threat, the epitome of the predator. But I am also your sanctuary. This is the duality you must master. Fear and safety in a single form. Your mind must reconcile the contradiction." He reached out, his hand moving with a speed she barely registered, and his fingers closed around the locket, gently tugging it from her grip. It felt like the severing of an internal tether. "This trinket," he murmured, holding the silver pendant up to the light. "It is not an anchor. It is a crutch. It binds the magic, but it does not control the emotion. We remove the crutch." With a barely audible, sharp snap, he broke the chain and dropped the locket into the deep, cavernous pocket of his tunic. He then took another step closer, his body now almost touching hers, and the raw, unshielded power he radiated was overwhelming. It felt like standing too close to a roaring furnace, except this furnace was pure, absolute cold. She could smell the faint, metallic, clean scent of him. Ozone, old dust, and a terrifying, clean scent of iron. Her breath hitched, her lungs suddenly seizing with panic. The void scar on her arms began to thrum with a painful, internal pressure. "Fear it, Alara. Let the terror consume you. Feel the need to lash out, to unleash the cessation upon the monster that stands before you," Ethelred commanded, his voice a low, intimate challenge. But in that very instant, choose the preservation, choose the control. Your life and the terms of the covenant depend upon this singular, impossible choice. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes burning into hers. The stillness of his body was now a terrible, focused weapon. He was waiting for the flicker of black on her skin, the sign of the void preparing to erupt. The pressure in her arm became excruciating. She could feel the power surging, desperate for release. She closed her eyes, the terror a blinding wave. Chapter 6. Ilara's mind screamed in the darkness. The crushing proximity of Ethelred, the removal of her locket, the sheer paralyzing magnitude of his ancient predatory power, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming surge of pure existential panic. The void scar on her arm was a white-hot brand, its entropic power gathering, ready to discharge the terrible black suction. The instinct was pure, unadulterated self-preservation. Destroy the threat, nullify the monster. But beneath the terror, a strange, crystalline thought formed, sharp and clear against the tide of panic. It was the memory of Ethelred's arm, the ancient, self-imposed apostasia. He is bound. He was the only thing preventing the Porhos and the Coven from unleashing a greater, global catastrophe. If she unleashed the void and killed him, the Covenant would fail, the balance would shatter, and her power would run wild, extinguishing everything. Her fear of becoming the monster was, ironically, her only chance. Choose the preservation. She opened her eyes, gasping, and met his gaze. His amber eyes were now burning with an unholy concentration, acknowledging the immense internal battle she was fighting. He saw the power brewing within her, the black energy clawing at her control, yet he made no move to retreat. He was testing her absolute limit, risking his own eternity on her fragile choice. "You have witnessed my burden," Ethelred murmured, his voice now a low, urging siren in the dark. "You know the cost of the apostasia. Now feel the weight of yours, Ilara. Feel the darkness and hold the line. Your choice is the only truth." The pain in her arm reached a critical peak. She felt the chill spreading, the signature of the cessation. She squeezed her eyes shut again, not in surrender, but in a final, agonizing focus. She pulled on the core conviction that had driven her across the continent, her intense, fearful need to not be the destructive force, her deep-seated guilt over the lives she had already unintentionally taken. She anchored herself not in love, but in the fierce, protective conviction of her own necessary restraint. "I choose not to shatter the world." The blackness surged, and then, slowly, agonizingly, it retreated. The white-hot intensity in the scar subsided, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. The metallic scent of ozone faded. The overwhelming pressure lifted, leaving her trembling violently, drenched in cold sweat, but intact. She had held the line. Ethelred remained utterly still, his breathing, if he even possessed the function, entirely undetectable. After a long moment of profound silence, he took a slow, deliberate step back, breaking the intimate, paralyzing proximity. "A moment of pure choice," he stated, his voice returning to its formal, executive resonance. "You chose restraint over survival, preservation over panic. The first lesson is concluded. You have reconciled the duality. I am both your deadliest threat and your necessary anchor. I can kill you, but I choose not to, and you can destroy me, but you choose not to. We are bound by a mutually assured, terrible conviction." He reached into his pocket and placed the silver locket back in her hand. It was cold, heavy, and suddenly meaningless. "The crutch is returned," he said, "but it is now only a symbol, not a binding mechanism. The next lesson is at dawn. We will work on the sustained application of that choice. The Porhos will cross the perimeter by midday. You have limited time to refine your self-control into an absolute lethal weapon. You are not a victim, Ilara. You are a queen of negation, currently without a crown. Now rest. You will need every scrap of strength you possess." He turned, the darkness seeming to welcome him, and he was gone as silently as he had arrived. Alara stood alone in the cold chamber, the locket heavy in her hand, the ache in her arm a testament to the magnitude of her terrible power. She was no longer running, she was fighting, chained to the darkest entity she had ever known, and driven by a desperate, quiet hope that her fear could be transformed into the greatest form of protective mastery. The high-stakes game had begun.